So, Jules Carter on Britain's only known species of Troglobitic spider. Jules, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to kick off this short series of science talks on the earth sciences, and I'm going to delve a little bit with a story about this wee beastie here, kind of as an illustration, really, of the joys of trying to study cave life, if you like, and in this case, slightly bigger cave life than some of the people who are going to be following me are going to be talking about. There's many challenges to trying to study cave invertebrates. That's kind of the area where I tend to work in. And essentially, it's just difficult to sample. It's difficult to find them. It's difficult to get a really good idea of what's there, where it's living. Obviously, parts of the cave we can access, but a lot of the life we're looking for is pretty sparse. It's pretty spread out. It's a real challenge. And another challenge, as I work in the museum world and I work in the natural sciences, is to actually preserve these samples in a way that you can actually study them, analyze them, preserve them, look at them afterwards, put them under an electron microscope, whatever. And that's a much bigger challenge than a lot of people realize, particularly with really small animal groups like springtails or mites and stuff like that. The other biggest challenge is actually identifying stuff. Certain groups like ground crustacea and things, and this one's actually, you can see, it's quite big, you know, a couple of mil. You can actually see it in the naked eye just. There's quite good keys and stuff for these sort of groups, and they're relatively straightforward in the scheme of things. But when you get to things, this is actually a predatory mite, and it's actually from down the Ogofy. Working with groups like that is much, much tougher. The identification keys, the information on them are really well spread out. It's a really tough job to actually work through them. And that provides a lot more time and effort in trying to work with this stuff. And ultimately, it's trying to gather long-term meaningful data. That is one of the biggest challenges. Getting good ecological data that means something over time is a massive challenge as well. Absence and presence data is easiest, but when you're trying to get information that spans time and changes in the ecology, it's a much bigger ask, really. A little bit of a history lesson, really. In Britain, the work of the Cave Research Group goes back to the 1930s, so we actually have quite a strong background in actually looking into biobiology and developing the science and the discovery of cave life in caves. Even though in a northern clime, our cave life is quite sparse. It's not exactly a biodiversity hotspot like certain parts of the world, but certainly the work of Mary Hazelton and others in the 1930s, 40s really drove forward this idea of trying to monitor the cave environment. And I was quite struck a few years ago when I was rummaging in the archives of the South Wales Caving Club to find this sort of bits of hand-drawn survey from the early days of down the Ogofy, the explorations of down the Ogofy. And what was quite interesting on this survey was they'd actually been looking to try and provide long-term monitoring sites in the cave for the biology of it. I don't know whatever happened to this. I've never really found any research on it or anything, but it would have been kind of a nice thing if some of these sites had been set up and if a long-term monitoring program been set. But going to the modern day, there's actually quite a lot of work going on, particularly with sort of groundwork biology. In the sort of 80s, two chaps, Jefferson and Chapman, did a fantastic piece of work with the Ogofy D system. I apologize for the Welsh bias here, but being a Welshman, you know, I've got to promote my nation a bit. Which got published into the Cave and Karst Science a few years back with a few upgrades to it. And then there's quite a lot of work going on the ground crustacea at the moment. A friend of mine, Gareth Spar, has been doing some really interesting work on in around the Vale of Glamorgan where we are, and Lee Knight has been doing some fantastic work with Lou Maurice and others in Drynan, for example, and doing some, I don't know when that research can come out, but some really good work coming out at the moment. My story is going to dwell on this sort of miserable little bugger here. It's a big thing. But why spiders in caves? Well, spiders are kind of an interesting thing to monitor in caves because they are one of the sort of carnivores. They're one of the upper parts of the food chain. So they're going to be even more sparse and more spread out than the other things. A lot of things that live in caves are quite adaptable. They'll take opportunities where they can, whereas if you're more of a carnivore, you've got to sort of hunt whether passively or actively and try and find your food. So cave spiders will, or these sort of upper parts of the food chain will be a bit rarer and a bit harder. Also, they're quite interesting from that point of view how they've adapted and how they moved into the cave environment. Now, there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment, cave spiders. There's a couple of Italians working on it. They're doing a big review. And roughly, there's about 1,000 species worldwide that are sort of thought to be associated with subterranean systems. When we get to UK, that's probably less than 20, and across much fewer families, really. And so this is a rough list. It's by no means accurate. There's probably a few species left out, but these are the main ones that have been recorded in caves in the UK or across Britain as a whole. And it's dominated by this group here, which is the Linophidiae. These are the small, sort of miserable spiders that we call money spiders. In the UK, we have about 650, close to 700 species of spider. Most of those are in this family group. Around about half the species in the UK are in this family group. So, when people are panicking about the big things and things crawling about their floor, actually most spiders are going to be in this sort of money spider group. And this group, Homer itself, has got a plasticity. It has a liking for the underground environment. Quite a few of the species occur in it. Obviously, the things that we associate as being called cave spiders, like Metamonadia, Metallina mariani, this is Metallina here, they're not really cave spiders, because we go into the, well, they are cave spiders because they use caves, but they're not true troglobitic spiders, because we go into how we try and define up the underground habitat, the sort of lifestyle choices of these sort of animals that we find into them. They can fall into what are loosely put into these three groups here. And most of those spiders are formed in those first two. They either have a bit of their lifestyle there, or they accidentally end up in the cave, and if there's enough energy and food coming through it, they can sort of persist with their lifestyle. But the one I'm looking at today, this little Homer rosenhari, is our only truly troglobitic spider. It is the only one that's considered to be a true sort of cave dweller. Now, it's not very big. You can see there, 2 mil. It's a bit of a bugger to find, because it tends to be calcite-colored, living on sort of calcite-colored rocks on tiny little webs. So it's a bit of a manual process trying to find this thing. And it's genuinely interesting to us because it is a very rare species in the UK fauna. And it's definitely considered to be troglobitic. It's been examined by quite a few people, and it's considered to be a very definite, very true species. And it does exhibit some of the prime things that we'd expect with a troglobitic one in terms of reduced pigmentation, regression of the eyes. It's considered to be blind, but you can see rudimentary eye spots on it. And whether it inhibits some of these other key factors like behavioral and psychological adaptations, we don't really know, because those sort of things are much harder to sort of study for. In the UK, the records of this almost goes back 50 years when it was first found. It's only known from 2 sites in the UK. One is Ogofy Cias, which is just north of Merthyr, where it was first found in 1971, and that was sort of the first records for it. That caused a flurry of interest because there was quite a lot of recording of the biology going on at that time, and people did look for it quite extensively. But it wasn't until the 1980s, when Jefferson and Chapman were exploring the Lesser Garth Cave, that they suddenly found that this species was also there in the Lesser Garth Cave. Lesser Garth is quite a different cave, and that one's located in the north of Cardiff, just north of Cardiff. So if you look at the world distribution map, you can see, or the British distribution map, you can see it's huge. It's everywhere. So for some reason, it's only in these 2 sites in South Wales. And if you go world distribution, it's known to be across Europe. The systematics are a bit more confused here because there's a lot more species and there's bound to be some confusion. But it's a similar story. It occurs across France and various other places, and there's even a couple of populations in Ireland as well. But it's the same thing. It's quite sporadic. It's quite spread out. It's quite rare. It doesn't occur in massive numbers across sort of karst areas in the caves that it occurs in, which is quite a curious story. I mean, why is that? I'll talk a little bit about the caves and about the research that's sort of been done over the years, subsequent to its finding. The most work has been done in Lesser Garth Cave. Now, it's quite handy that I've done a lot of work with this, because actually I live right next to Lesser Garth Cave, so it's not too far to go, which is excellent. Lesser Garth Cave is quite an interesting cave. It's, the main passage is actually quite a big piece of cave, draped with flowstone. It's quite an important archaeological site as well. There's some quite early remains of humans have been found into it. Although some of the archaeology has been less, digging in it's been less than kind to the actual cave. But it's sort of formed in a doltomized black rock limestone, so it's quite an unusual system, and it also connects up with a couple of other caves. Ogofy and Taff is just kind of over here, and this choke probably goes up to Pennacrig, which is another little cave. So it's a system of about 300, 400 meters of cave in total. The cave itself is quite an interesting one from a biospeleology point of view. In terms of the UK fauna, a lot of stuff is found here, including the little isopod Procellus cavaticus and a couple of little pools in it. A very isolated and a very sort of unusual population for this particular cave. Like both these sites, it's in quite a precarious position really these days. Right on the edge of northern Cardiff, my house is there. It's right next to the very active Taswell quarry. This is a huge limestone quarry, and it's this whole mountain's void because just here is actually the Garth Iron Mine complex as well, which is a series of huge chambers. And they're currently mining, digging out this lot here. They've got about 30 million tons of reserve in there, and they'll take about 1 million a year out. So it's a very active quarry. And the work on this spider sort of started out in about 1997, and the reason for it was the quarry wanted to extend, get the application it's put in now to extend to where it was going. But at that stage, it still had an interim development order sitting on a lot of that limestone. So it could have taken away, quite legitimately, whether under the legislative protection they had at the time, the Lesser Garth complex and all that beach woodland on the side, and it would have really opened up the quarry as an eyesore. So that's when we came in at the museum. We got asked, did this spider still exist in the cave, and could we go look for it? So in 1997, myself and a friend of mine, Darren Mann, who is an entomologist of some repute, and extinction follows his collecting policy because he's a very good collector, shall we say. We dived into the Lesser Garth cave, came out with loads of new records for it, and established that the spider was still present. And then a few years more recently, what was then the Countryside Council of Wales is now a part of National Resources Wales in the UK. They wanted to know, could we set up something called a Common Standards Monitoring Project? And the whole process of that was just to establish to see, could we set up a protocol that enabled people to go in the cave at certain intervals and just monitor the cave overall, but most importantly, to monitor the population of this spider. And that's what we did. Now, there's nothing hard, it's just hard graft to this. You've got to get stuck in and have a good look around and try and find this thing. And it's useful to have a couple of bods to get your eye in. It's not an easy thing to spot. And what it tends to particularly like is these sort of little cracks and crevices. I used to think it would be more prevalent on the walls of the cave, but it isn't. It'll be on the floors, it'll be in the rock debris on the floors, and they live on these really fine sheet webs. So the thing you've got to look out for is the really fine sheet web, and you need to use raking light for it and get your eyes in on it. And if you're lucky, you might actually spot the spider sitting on it, if you're lucky. And so that's what we started to do. So it's quite a manual process getting stuck in, but in a way it's quite therapeutic. And the results of that work were quite interesting because we monitored whether the presence of webs, we also monitored the presence of other fauna in the cave, and we discovered that in one survey it was quite numerous. When we did it later in the year, the numbers were dropping a bit, and it started to suggest that there is a bit of population dynamics going here. You know, are they fully troglobitic? There's a few questions being raised by this. There seemed to be a bit of seasonality to the population numbers, but only time will sort of bear that out. And that was a few conclusions that we sort of came from that part of the work, really. But the nice thing about it was, despite the disturbance, this site gets really, really badly disturbed by locals. A whole load of nonsense goes in there. We've been in there where people have just set fires in the entrance and the rest of it. It's a site for lesser horseshoe bats. But somehow, as the biology and the cave biology shows us, the site persists. You know, the biology sort of persists all this disturbance and nonsense that tends to go into this cave. Doesn't seem so bad as late. And it's even been picked up by the BBC. So a few years ago, we had great fun. Tim and Pam Fogg were, funny enough, the underground protection on this, if you like. And we're working with this guy, Ross Piper, to actually do a filming piece on the spiders for a BBC programme called Wild, which was on Saturday mornings and partly live, but with little inserts on all things wildlife. And we actually did a short piece, which turned out very well. And we even dragged, Sid was talking about dragging kit up, we even dragged up this microscope and stuff and with a feed on it and collected some spiders and filmed them in the cave, directly sort of running around, which was a bit of a first. The unfortunate thing about that tale, which is a slight digression, is Ross is sitting on, it's his microscope, he's sitting on it. I asked him if he wanted a hand when we were trying to get it back down the hill. He slipped, let go of it, and it was like a bouncing Barnes Wallis bomb that ended up in the allotments at the bottom. So it was just as well nobody was in the way, and the microscope was broken. So look after your kit. Ogofy Cias is where this spider was first found. And as far as we can tell, nobody's been back since until very recently to establish whether the population was still present in this cave. Ogofy Cias is very different to Lesser Garth. It's in a very pretty little valley, the Vaenor Valley, the Nantgleis Valley, next to the Vaenor. And there's two key systems that dominate this. Ogofy Cias on one side of this little valley, and the famous, or more infamous Ogofy Cias the other side, which is a very sporting trip. Ogofy Cias is quite straightforward, grade 2 cave-in. It's used heavily by groups and things. And it's kind of interesting because it's sort of dominated by the sort of dolomitic limestone that sits on the floor there, which are relatively insoluble. So they're quite shallow features, both these caves. Interesting enough, it's in a similar story to the Lesser Garth system in that it's sitting right next to a huge quarry currently mothballed, but Hanson's, the owner of this quarry, are currently looking to reopen it, and they reckon they've got about 40, 50 million tons of reserve in there. So it's actually, this work has been quite timely of late because the priority or the importance of the Nantgleis in terms of this proposed work has been raised again. And there's some work coming out of this at the moment and some new geological mapping going on, which is kind of interesting. Though the biggest threat is probably this hill down here is Merthyr, and that's probably the biggest threat to anything in this area, unfortunately. So when we went into Ogofy Cias recently, working with the National Resource Wales, it was kind of interesting. We established a few areas where the spider was definitely in quite considerable numbers and quite a hot spot for them. And then it was sporadically, the grey areas, it was sporadically present in other areas. Quite a difficult cave to comfortably survey. You tend to have to look at the more accessible points. But what was also interesting was this little fella is a harvestman and of the opulums, a harvestman. It's called Sabacon. It was first recorded in South Wales about 30, 40 years ago. It's considered to be an introduction, and it's definitely spreading. So both Lestergarth and Ogofy Cias have got populations of this little harvestman through them now, which they definitely didn't have a few years ago. So this fella's definitely spreading quite rapidly across South Wales, and has got a paucity for the underground environment. And this is another one that occurs across the cave. This is an Esticus, or the cellar or cavity spider, and that seems to be quite prevalent across the whole cave as well. So that's really what the enigma about this is, why is this spider so rare in Britain? And it's not really, we don't really know. The first question is it under-recorded? Quite potentially. But a lot of cave biologists have been looking for it over the years. And it's a similar story in Ireland. It's quite a rare species just in a couple of sites. And people have, over the years, sort of looked for it. Undoubtedly, as part of that, is something to do with glaciation and sort of recolonization of it. Could it be taxonomic uncertainty? Certainly across Europe as a whole, then the taxonomic status of some of these species is questionable. But Pohoma itself, Rosenhari, this species in the UK, has been looked at quite extensively, and it is a defined and true, considered a very good species. And there is a review by a Czech character at the moment sort of going on that. Ecology and lifestyle is more difficult. We actually don't know much about this, and we don't know about how these populations relate to each other. So talking a bit more about that is the rarity is probably a factor of our glaciation and the way the climate and the habitat of the UK has been affected over the last sort of 10 to 15,000 years. But it's still a question, how did these sort of come back in or recolonize or under the ice sheets? The Garth population is on the edge of what the ice sheets probably were. The Ogofy Cias population is probably within the sort of boundaries of some of the ice sheets. But it still begs the question, why hasn't it sort of occurred in the southwest, which has been more relatively ice-free and more relatively unaffected, and there's no populations here at all? So that's quite a question in itself, really. A group itself, Pohoma, this is the number of species we get in the UK. Some are very common, some are very rare. It's got a tendency to move into the underground environment. So if you start to look into that group and the numbers that are found in the soil and cavities in the soil or underground, then about half the group are actually found in it. And if you dig deeper again, then about half of those again actually have a paucity to be found into the cave environment. And of course, of those three, the true sort of little Troglobitic one is considered Rosenhari is among that group. So the group as a whole has got a tendency to sort of evolve, if you like, or utilize the underground or the darker environments in some way. And the one thing we don't know is how extensive it is in parts of the habitat that we can't analyze. And one of those particularly important habitats, so caves can sort of be defined up into a number of ecological zones, and you can be subcompartmentalized into many different ones, but that gets really tedious then. But there's the core ones, the threshold, which is kind of the surface area, the dark zone, as we sort of consider the main cave itself. But what's interesting, and there's certainly across Europe and other parts of the world, is this superficial underground compartment, which is kind of the fractured rock zone between the overlying soil burden and the cave itself. And in a lot of parts of the world, they've been finding very defined ecology going in this zone. But in the UK, we know very, very little about it. Is it a defined ecology going on? Are things like this spider present in it? Does this mean it's more prevalent, and this is how it disperses or how it connects with itself and other populations? We simply don't know at this stage. It's a very difficult area to sort of sample and understand. And that sort of takes us to current work, really. What will hopefully come out of this with this ongoing common standards monitoring is maybe to give us a bit more feel about the lifestyle of it. And if we could sample a bit deeper or maybe get into this sort of superficial underground compartment habitat, maybe we can establish how much further this spider sort of lives or is extended in that part of the world. So some of the things that are desirable in the future is to look a bit more into that and maybe there's an excellent project here for anyone who's into sort of the genetics and the population genetics, is to look at how these two populations that we know of in the UK relate to each other, and how they relate to the European populations as a whole. That would be quite good. So, yeah, that's some of the things that were desirable in the future. To look a bit more in the taxonomy of Rosenhari, Pohoma as a whole, which is actually a bit of it ongoing at the moment. To keep the monitoring of these caves going, because we're actually establishing a protocol now and we're getting some information, and it's a good thing. The genetics would be excellent, and if we could establish what this subsurface karst community is doing, that would be even better. But ultimately, you know, what is the great value of this? Well, it gives us an insight into the underground world, and I particularly like this quote from Jerry Lewis, a cave biologist. You know, it's not really about this spider on its own. It's about the whole ecology of our caves and understanding the whole ecology of the caves, and the importance that ecology has to understanding our environment as a whole. And I think we need a holistic point of view on this rather than worrying about, you know, what does a little tiny blind miserable spider from South Wales tell us. That as a whole tells us many things if we look at the whole cave, its ecology, the whole karstic environment as a whole. And ultimately, you never really know what you'll find. That's about all I've got to say.